Good evening. Settle in and close your eyes. Let me take you back, across the oceans of time, to a world far older than ours. It is the year 1347. The air is cool. Cobblestone streets hung with the quiet lives of merchants and farmers, monks and maidens. In towns across Europe, candles flicker behind wooden shutters. Life moves slowly. Seasons turn gently from spring to summer, from summer to autumn. Yet far across the waters, on the distant edges of trade routes and merchant ships, something stirs. Something unseen. Something that will drift silently, from shore to shore, like mist rolling across a field at dawn. They will call it the Great Pestilence. We know it as the Black Death. But tonight, we will walk gently through these forgotten days. Together, we will listen to their stories, feel their hopes, and rest in the knowledge that even in darkness, humanity endures. Now, breathe deeply. And let the story unfold. Before the dark winds of the plague began to blow, Europe was a tapestry of life, color, and tradition. In the bustling towns of Italy, merchants bustled through busy markets, their arms heavy with silks, spices, and strange goods from lands far away. In the soft, rolling countryside of France and England, farmers rose with the sun and worked the land, tilling the fields, tending their animals, and gathering by firelight when the day's labors were done. Life moved slowly, in step with the seasons. Winters were cold and long, but filled with song and shared stories. Summers were warm and fragrant, buzzing with the life of growing crops and distant fairs. For most people, the world was small. A single village, a familiar road, a local river. Journeys were rare, and often perilous. News from afar traveled slowly, carried by wandering monks, weary travelers, or traders returning from foreign ports. Medicine, in those days, was a mystery wrapped in ancient knowledge and sacred belief. Sickness was thought to come from imbalances of the body's four humors, or from foul, invisible mists known as miasmas, or even, some whispered, from the displeasure of the heavens above. Doctors wore long robes and carried simple tools. Apothecaries ground herbs in stone mortars, offering remedies of lavender, garlic, rosemary, hoping to chase away the unseen spirits of illness. Churches and monasteries stood tall in every village, their bells calling people to prayer, to baptism, to marriage, to final rites. Faith was a pillar of life, unquestioned, all-encompassing. When a child fell ill, parents knelt and prayed. When rains failed to come, fields were blessed with holy water. It was a world shaped by hope and uncertainty, woven together by tradition, community, and the eternal turning of the seasons. And in this world of simple joys and quiet hardships, life carried on, just as it had for centuries. Unaware that something was already moving across distant lands. Unseen, unstoppable. And on its way. Far from Europe's shores, across the distant lands of the East, caravans wound their way through deserts and mountains. Traders carried silks and spices, jewels and paper, porcelain and gold. These goods traveled slowly, hand to hand, across the vast Silk Road, from China, through the Middle East, and toward the markets of Europe. Alongside their treasures, the merchants unknowingly carried something else. Something far smaller, and far more deadly. Tiny fleas, riding upon the backs of black rats. And within their tiny bodies, a sickness that would reshape the world. In the autumn of 1347, a fleet of ships from the Crimea arrived at the port of Messina, on the island of Sicily. The people who gathered at the docks to welcome them were met not with cheers, but with horror. On board the ships were dead and dying sailors, their bodies marked by strange black swellings. Their faces pale and hollow. Their breathing ragged and weak. Fear spread through the port like wildfire. Some said it was a punishment from God. Others spoke of curses carried by the winds. Officials ordered the ships to be turned away, but it was too late. The sickness had already come ashore, carried not just by the sailors, but by the unseen rats and fleas that scurried into warehouses, homes, and alleyways. From Messina, the plague began its slow and steady march northward, crossing into mainland Italy, flowing along the well-traveled roads of trade and pilgrimage. In the months that followed, new whispers rose in every marketplace, every tavern, every church. Stories of whole villages falling silent overnight. Streets emptying. Bells tolling endlessly for the dead. Some towns tried to protect themselves. Gates were closed. Travelers were turned away. Bonfires were lit in the streets to cleanse the air. In some places, people wore masks stuffed with herbs and sweet-smelling flowers, hoping to filter the foulness they believed floated on the breeze. And yet, no matter how tightly they barred their doors, no matter how many prayers were said, the sickness came. As inevitable as the setting of the sun. The sickness moved quietly at first. A whisper in one town, a rumor in another. It flowed along the winding roads of merchants and pilgrims, hidden in the folds of cloaks, in the straw of wagons, in the creaking holds of riverboats. From Messina, it crossed to mainland Italy. From Genoa to Venice. From Venice to Milan. Like ink spreading through parchment, it darkened every corner it touched. In the city streets, fear blossomed like wildfire. Once busy markets grew silent. Stalls stood abandoned, their fruits and meats left to spoil in the sun. Doctors, known for their long, bird-like masks filled with fragrant herbs, patrolled the streets, a strange and unsettling sight to those who remained indoors. Priests walked solemnly through empty squares, whispering prayers over the dying, their footsteps echoing against the cold stones. Monks in monasteries transcribed notes of what they witnessed, their hands trembling over parchment. Villages fared no better. In the countryside, the plague was carried by travelers seeking refuge. Peasants fled the towns, hoping the clean air of the fields would save them. But the sickness followed. In some places, whole villages vanished. Fields lay untended. Livestock wandered freely, the bells around their necks jingling into the empty air. Carts piled high with bodies rolled down narrow lanes, drawn by men who covered their faces with cloths soaked in vinegar. Bells tolled without end, not for weddings, nor for births, but for the passing of countless souls. Some towns tried desperate measures. Fires were set in the streets, great pillars of smoke rising into the sky, meant to cleanse the air of the invisible poison. Public prayers were held, hundreds kneeling in open fields, faces turned to the heavens, begging for mercy. In certain cities, groups of penitents, known as flagellants, marched from place to place. They whipped themselves in the streets, chanting hymns, hoping their suffering might appease divine anger. They believed the plague was a punishment, a test, a reckoning. Yet the plague did not discriminate. It touched the rich and the poor, the pious and the wicked, the young and the old, kings in their castles, monks in their cloisters, children in their cradles. All were equal in the eyes of the pestilence. Imagine a young merchant named Matteo. In the busy port of Pisa, he once spent his days haggling over spices and silks, laughing with friends by the harbor. As the sickness reached his city, Matteo watched the ships vanish from the bay, the market stalls close, the streets grow silent. One by one, his friends fell ill. Matteo too grew feverish, lying alone in the upper room of his small house, listening to the distant toll of the funeral bells. In a quiet village in the English countryside, a farmer named Alice tended her sheep. She heard of the sickness from passing monks, and though she lived far from the great cities, fear weighed heavy in her heart. When the signs of illness came to her village, when neighbors grew pale and breathless, she retreated to the hills with her flock, praying for the wind to spare her. In a cold, stone monastery perched on a hill, a young monk named Brother Thomas tended the sick, risking his own life to bring water and prayer to the dying. He wrote in his journal, "The pestilence does not sleep. It comes as a thief in the night, and no soul is beyond its reach. Yet in the face of such sorrow, we serve and we hope." And still, day by day, the sickness spread outward. North into France and England, east into Germany and Hungary, southward to Spain and beyond. No land untouched, no city spared. Only the seas and the high mountains offered some refuge, and even there, the fear of the unseen lingered like a heavy mist. In time, the maps of Europe became a patchwork of silence. Where there had once been laughter, only the cawing of crows. Where there had once been music, only the soft sigh of the wind through abandoned streets. Yet even then, even in the darkest moments, some small fires of life continued to burn. Life did not vanish completely. Even under the shadow of the Black Death, people continued to live, to hope, to love. In the small pockets of survival, families gathered close behind heavy doors. They hung sprigs of rosemary and thyme above their doorways, believing the herbs could ward off the invisible spirits of disease. Windows were shuttered, streets deserted, yet behind those closed walls, candles still flickered. Mothers told stories to their children in hushed voices, weaving tales of distant heroes and magical lands, to soothe them to sleep. Hush now, little one. Close your eyes, and dream of green fields, and the morning sun. You are safe here, safe with me. In the monasteries that still stood, monks continued their quiet work. They tended the gardens, copied sacred texts by dim candlelight, and cared for the sick when no one else dared. Their prayers rose into the night sky like smoke. Sancta Maria, ora pro nobis. Holy Mary, pray for us. In villages where the plague had already passed, survivors gathered in small, trembling groups. They buried their dead with songs and tears, planting small wooden crosses in the fields where once wheat had grown. There was grief. Deep, endless grief. But there was also resilience. In the aftermath of sorrow, new communities were born. Neighbors who had once barely spoken now depended on one another, for food, for comfort, for prayer. People found new ways to endure. Some turned to medicine, creating new remedies from herbs, tree bark, and roots. Some turned to faith, believing that acts of kindness might earn divine mercy. Others turned to music and art, pouring their sorrow into songs, paintings, and poems that would live on long after the plague had passed. Tonight, we sing not for sorrow, but for hope. For those who remain, and those who wait for us beyond the stars. In some cities, when the sickness began to ebb, people crept cautiously back into the streets. They found their towns changed, quieter, emptier, but still standing. In Venice, gondolas drifted silently through the misty canals, bearing simple wreaths of flowers instead of passengers. In Paris, the great cathedrals echoed with the soft footsteps of a few survivors lighting candles for those they had lost. In small English hamlets, the tolling bells, once deafening, grew softer, until finally, for the first time in months, there was silence. A new kind of silence. Not of death, but of survival. A hush filled with the breath of those who remained. The great wave of pestilence had passed through them like a storm through a forest, leaving some trees broken, but others still standing, roots sunk deep into the earth. And in the gentle quiet that followed, life began again. The plague left its mark not just on the bodies of the fallen, but on the very soul of Europe. When the sickness began to wane, the survivors slowly emerged from their homes, blinking in the soft light of a world that felt both familiar and strange. In the towns and cities where death had once ruled, now there was a quiet, a stillness, like the hush of the earth before the dawn. And yet, life had changed forever. The most obvious change was the population. In some places, entire villages had disappeared. In others, only a handful of survivors remained. This sudden and tragic loss left a society that was not only grieving, but rebuilding. The survivors, those who had lived through the storm, now held the keys to a world that had been reshaped. There were not enough workers to tend the fields. Not enough hands to run the markets. In places like France and Italy, the labor shortage became so severe that it shifted the balance of power. Peasants, once bound to the land by the harsh chains of feudalism, now found themselves in a position of strength. With so many serfs and farmers gone, those who remained were in demand. They could negotiate better wages, better conditions. And in time, many villages and towns found themselves free of the old ways that had bound them for centuries. The land is mine now, as much as it is the earth's. No lord shall command me. I will plant, and I will harvest, for my family's future. This shift in power slowly spread through Europe, where the feudal system began to erode. And while this change was painful for the wealthy and the powerful, it marked the beginning of a new era. One where individuals held more sway over their own lives. But the plague was not just a political force. It changed the way people thought about everything. Art, once focused on religious themes, began to reflect the human experience, the fragility of life, the reality of death, and the complexity of the human soul. Artists painted skulls, rotting flowers, decaying flesh, but also beautiful landscapes, dancing figures, and renewed hope. People began to see life as precious, fragile, and every moment became a small act of defiance against the overwhelming force of nature. The church, too, was forever changed. The plague had left a deep scar in the hearts of the faithful. For some, it felt as though God had abandoned them, punishing them for their sins. For others, it was a test, a moment to reflect on the transience of life. But in the wake of the plague, many began to question the established doctrines. New ideas began to take root, and the Renaissance was born, an era that would see a flowering of human knowledge, art, and philosophy. The fields began to flourish again, slowly at first. The harvests returned, and the towns began to rebuild. But in every stone laid, in every brick built, there was an echo of the loss they had endured. And through this silence, through the slow, patient rebuilding, the people began to heal. Not just their homes, but their hearts. Slowly, the shadow of the plague lifted, as all storms eventually pass. The streets, once filled with silence and sorrow, began to breathe again, filled with the sound of footsteps, tentative at first, but growing stronger with each passing day. People returned to their homes and their work, but they returned with a new understanding of life. They had survived a trial that had touched the deepest parts of their souls, and now, they moved through the world with both humility and hope. In the fields, the earth grew green again. The seeds of yesterday's sorrow blossomed into the flowers of tomorrow's promise. Farmers planted new crops, tending them with both care and gratitude, for they knew now just how fleeting life could be. As the harvests returned, so too did the markets, though quieter now, and filled with a deep, peaceful sense of community. The once boisterous crowds now gathered in a more gentle manner, exchanging goods, but also words of kindness and understanding. The streets, though still touched by the memory of what had passed, began to echo with laughter once more. We have seen the darkness, but we have also seen the dawn. We have known the night, but now we know the beauty of the day. We hold the gift of life more dearly than ever before. Art flourished, as people began to celebrate the return of beauty to the world. Painters filled their canvases with flowers and fields, with skies so blue they seemed to shimmer with life. Sculptors carved faces of hope, their hands smoothing marble that had once felt cold and distant. Poets wrote of resilience, of the strength to overcome, and of the simple joy in waking to a new day. The churches, once filled with cries of desperation, began to hum softly with songs of thanks and renewal. The ringing of the bells, which had once tolling for the dead, now rang in celebration, quiet, but strong, like a heartbeat returning to life. And time, in its slow and patient rhythm, continued its journey. It was not a world that could ever forget, for the memory of the plague was etched into the hearts of all who had lived through it. But it was a world that had learned, in some quiet corner of the soul, how to rebuild. Do you think the stars remember the night when the earth was dark? I think they do. They still shine because they have seen everything, and yet, they never stop. There was grief, of course. There were those who would never return, and there was a sadness that would remain, woven into the very fabric of life. But the resilience of the human spirit shone brighter. People reached out to one another, offering a hand, a smile, a shared meal, and in that, they began to heal. Slowly, quietly, they embraced the future, knowing it was fragile. But so, too, was the beauty of every moment they had. And as the years passed, the world found its balance again. The cities began to rise, their gates open, their walls rebuilt. The countryside bloomed with fresh crops, and the rivers once again carried the boats of merchants, their sails unfurled toward new horizons. But in the hearts of those who had lived through the plague, there remained a quiet understanding that life was a precious gift. That it was meant to be lived with gratitude, with awareness, and with love for all the small moments that made it so beautiful. And with that, the world turned, as it always had. One breath at a time.